If I were asked about how my thinking had developed about religion and theology over the years, I think I'd like to point to some theologians, some philosophers, and also some novelists and some poets, because ever since my school days I've been a keen reader of poetry and of fiction and drama too, and I found that that's constantly kept my sense of what faith is really about alive. Intellectually, when I was first studying theology here in Cambridge at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, I had the privilege of a very unusual teacher called Donald Mackinnon, a Scotsman, as the name might suggest, a philosopher, and somebody who wrote very little and whose lectures were almost indescribably difficult to follow. But what he conveyed to us, I think, was the sense that this is such a rich, such a complex and challenging area of human thinking that you're never going to get on top of it, and you just have to be very, very patient in following through arguments with all the honesty that you can. So that really what he was doing for us was modeling a way of thinking, not giving us a lot of answers, but showing us how you needed all the time to be very suspicious of quick solutions and easy formulations in theology. Now, he himself was doctrinally quite old-fashioned. That is, he believed the creeds, he believed in the virgin birth and the resurrection, and he was somebody who would have described himself, I think, as an Orthodox Anglican, Anglo-Catholic Christian. But at the same time, he didn't think that that let you off the thinking. He didn't think it was an alibi. And anyone who'd studied with him would have absorbed something of that passion, that sense that the difficulties were necessary, the difficulties were unavoidable. You had to sit with them, and you had to approach your theology with a sense of humility and a sense that you were going to be stretched as well and tested. But in my 20s, when I was doing my research in theology, I found that the biggest influences on me then were generally from some Eastern Christian writers, especially Russian Christian writers. I was writing my dissertation about Russian Orthodox writers in the early 20th century. And I was intrigued that many of those who were expelled from Russia and who ended up in France in the 1920s and 30s were on very close and friendly terms with some Roman Catholic theologians of that era who were trying to create a sort of new look in French Catholic theology. And for both the Eastern Christian and the Roman Catholic writers, this was all about going back to sources, going back to the theologians of the first few centuries, the fathers of the church. And that was for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, these are writers who were working before the great division in the church between East and West, before the Reformation, the divide between Catholics and Protestants. That's to say, they represent a kind of common language for thinking Christians. And as you look at the fathers of the church, you see that here are people with immense intellectual equipment and great intellectual energy and courage and imagination. People who are not trying to set up an artificial separation between theology and the life of discipleship and prayer. Many of them, of course, are bishops, and so they do their theology as they preach or as they write commentaries on the Bible. So you don't have an easy way of breaking this up into Bible and history and philosophy and doctrine and so forth. It's all the same thing. It's thinking out loud about what it's like to be a Christian and what sort of God you must believe in to work as a Christian, to have a sort of functional life as a Christian. And so the doctrines about God as Holy Trinity, the doctrines about Christ as truly God and truly human, these aren't just theories that are worked out in the study. These are models of God, ways of talking about God, that are, as you might say, squeezed out of the experience of Christian praying and Christian living together, the Christian sacraments, Christian worship. So for all those reasons, I found the influence of the fathers of the church just enormously important at that particular point. And to see how these writers were picked up and used afresh by Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic writers of the 20th century, that was quite an inspiration. And some of that Roman Catholic thinking of the period of course, went into the background of the Second Vatican Council, the great reforming council of the 1960s, so had quite an impact on the wider life of the Catholic Church. And as an Anglican, I belonged already in a tradition which took the fathers of the Church very seriously, which took the first few centuries of Christian life as a sort of model. When I was reading around in theology in the 1970s, when I was working on my research and teaching a bit, some of the figures who really made an impact on me then would have included Henri de Lubac, the great Roman Catholic thinker who spanned a huge range of scholarly interests. He was one of those people who was in the forefront of rediscovering the Christian fathers of the first few centuries. He was also somebody who was really fascinated by the way in which Christian reading of the Bible had developed, different ways of reading the Bible literally and symbolically. He was someone who had a very active interest in dialogue with other faiths, especially Buddhism, and his great work was on how he thought some of the teachings of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, had been misused and misinterpreted to drive a great wedge between nature and grace, between creation and the Creator. So he wanted to talk very often about the way in which nature itself, the world that God makes, is never just shut up in itself. It's always open to the love and the grace of God, always in process of being transformed. So he was, I'd say, a very considerable influence. And I can remember when I was about 24 or 25, spending a summer holiday reading a book of his called Catholicism. And although it has that title, it's not narrowly about Roman Catholicism. It's about the whole vision of how you know things in community, how the life of the community, the Christian community, centered on the Holy Communion, on baptism, on the common life and common prayer, how that is actually something that helps you know God. You don't know God just by sitting on your own, just by reading books, not even just by reading the Bible. You read the Bible in company, you pray in company, and what happens then is what he would call the Catholic experience, that is, experiencing, knowing, loving, discovering yourself in the community of the Church. And that's always been a benchmark for me about what works and what doesn't in theology. And then finally, as I moved on and started writing theology myself and exploring a bit further, I found that I needed to keep very much in touch with and in dialogue with some modern philosophy, and to make sure that I was trying to understand what modern philosophers were saying. And in my 40s, became very friendly with a remarkable philosopher, Gillian Rose, who used to teach in the University of Warwick, and was one of those people who, with a very deep Jewish background, was also fascinated by Christian theology and the overlap between the Jewish world, the Christian world, and her professional world, which was the philosophy of especially 19th century Germany. And I learned a great deal there as well. I think just to go on letting yourself be challenged and stimulated by an intellectual world that's bigger than just theology is a hugely important thing.